The Tunstall Ranch, Lincoln County, New Mexico. February 18th, 1878. John Tunstall lays dead on the grounds of his cattle ranch, shot twice through the chest and once through the head, the victim of a cold-blooded execution at the hands of apostles sent to take cattle for a debt payment by Sheriff William Brady. Tunstall, a native of Hackney, London, England, had ventured to the American West with designs on earning a fortune in industry. He had joined with Alexander McSween, a lawyer of Scottish descent, born in Canada. They ventured together to compete with Lincoln County's primary business, the house, a dry goods store that supplied the region and did significant business in the cattle trade, having procured large government contracts to provide beef to the U.S. Army and Native American reservations. The incursion into their profitable empire was not welcomed by the proprietors of the house, namely James Dolan and Sheriff Brady. Things would take a violent turn when McSween interjected himself in a matter of an insurance settlement upon the death of one of the house's largest customers, who owed a significant debt to the operation. McSween secured the payment for the policy, but refused to turn it over, fearing it would go to pay the debt to his cash-strapped competition in the house. A judgment was issued against McSween, and Sheriff Brady began to attach McSween's property to pay it off. He went above and beyond the amount needed for the satisfaction of the debt, and even roped his partner Tunstall into the mix by attaching his cattle. The sheriff's posse that had been sent to the Tunstall Ranch to procure the cattle had come into contact with John Tunstall alone, who had been separated from the rest of his party, who had been busy herding the livestock. A vanguard of the posse had encountered Tunstall when he was on his own, on a trail leading to Ruidoso, just 4 miles to the north. With Tunstall had been Billy the Kid, Dick Brewer, John Middleton, and others, but they were too far separated from Tunstall to see his encounter with the posse. John Middleton heard the exchange of gunfire, and upon heading down to the location of Tunstall's encounter with the posse, saw him lying prone with his head covered with a blanket, and cried out, "They have killed Tunstall." The fateful mid-February day, in this picturesque, elevated mountain terrain of southern New Mexico, was starkly contrasted with the scene of a vicious act of retribution in the murder of John Tunstall. Sheriff Brady would officially claim that John Tunstall had fired on the posse while positioned directly in front of them, and that he had been killed when the posse had returned fire. This account appeared highly improbable to the friends and kin who knew John Tunstall as a mild-mannered and thoughtful man. At 11 o'clock that night, Billy the Kid and Robert Weidman reached Lincoln with the news of the killing. Tensions immediately grew high amongst the townspeople, as this escalation of feud between McSween and the house would certainly beget more bloodshed. 60 men gathered at McSween's house to hear the story of the Tunstall Ranch and to give him their reassurance that he would be supported in his desire for justice. The sentiments of the locals had shifted so strongly in support of McSween that Dolan grew concerned. Had they simply taken McSween's property, as they had been given court authority to do, they could have diminished their primary competition and perhaps even caused them to withdraw from Lincoln County. Now, they were engaged in a bitter feud that could endanger not only their business interests, but even their lives. In order to carry out the arrest of those responsible for the killing, Tunstall's allies and friends formed a group known as the Regulators. While the Regulators had at various times existed with dozens of American and Mexican cowboys, the core of the membership were known as the Ironclad. Included in this were Dick Brewer, Frank McNabb, Doc Skurlock, Jim French, and the man who found Tunstall's expired body, John Middleton. The party would also include the notorious William Henry Bonney, also known as Billy the Kid. The Regulators were deputized by the Lincoln County Justice of the Peace, and on March 1st, Dick Brewer was appointed town constable. They were to bring in the men wanted for the killing of Tunstall. The Regulators had begun as a vigilante mob, but were now operating under the authority of the law. Dick Brewer sought to deliver the killers to justice, and not to make a scene of further chaos and death, if it could be so avoided. They intended to deliver the suspects to be held until trial at the next term of court, just 4 weeks away. News arrived in Lincoln that many of the individuals involved in the killing of John Tunstall were down on the Pecos River at Dolan and Riley's cow camp. Brewer gathered the Regulators together and rode out of town with haste. They would reach the Pecos on March 4th. They spent the next 2 days scouting the area, and their diligence would pay off when they discovered a few of the men suspected of the Tunstall murder. Just below the crossing on the Rio Penasco, Brewer and company jumped a party of 5 men that scattered into 2 groups: William Morton, Frank Baker, and Sam Lloyd in one, and 2 other men in the other. Dick Brewer was quick to recognize Morton and Baker, and determined to make them the primary target of their operation. Brewer and his men chased the 3 murder suspects in a grueling 6-mile pursuit that was tantamount to a running fight, with bullets being exchanged at one another and horses pressed to their absolute breaking point. Sam Lloyd's horse gave out, and as he was moments from being overtaken by the posses of Regulators, Brewer continued to chase and left him behind, focused now upon Baker and Morton, the primary men responsible for the execution of John Tunstall. At long last, the horses of Morton and Baker gave out near one another, and the men then prepared to make their final stand in a recess in the terrain, covered by thick tulle. After a tense standoff, Morton and Baker agreed to come up. Morton was the leader of the small detachment of the Brady posse that had engaged Tunstall and killed him. Baker was part of another group, but one that was also directly tied to the killing. Brewer swore they would not face retribution from his men, and that they simply intended to deliver them up to trial. Billy the Kid openly took exception to Brewer's intentions, stating, "Dick, we've 2 of them and they're the worst of the lot. Let's avenge John Tunstall by killing them right here and now." Dick Brewer again deferred on this opportunity for frontier justice, and they set off towards Lincoln with the prisoners in tow. The capture of the 2 men had not occurred until it was nearly dusk, so the party decided to make camp for the night at a cow camp on John Chisholm's ranch. The next day, they embarked upon a significantly longer stretch of the journey, traveling all the way to the headquarters of Chisholm's ranch at the South Spring River. They made their camp there on the night of Thursday, March 8th. Concern grew amongst Brewer's men in regards to the reception they would be given upon their arrival in Lincoln. Everything they had done thus far was in accordance with the law, under the blessing of the justice of the peace, as they were executing a warrant for the arrest of murder suspects. But by bringing in 2 prisoners so closely connected to Dolan and the house, wouldn't turning the prisoners over to his primary ally in Sheriff Brady simply negate the had just undertaken? And what sort of revenge could they expect from Dolan and Brady's men once they simply freed Baker and Morton? These deliberations amongst the party took a dark turn when news arrived from Lincoln to their camp that Dolan had gathered a group of men, numbering some 20 or more, and was sending them to cut off Brewer's party on the road to Lincoln, and engage them by whatever means it took to secure the release of Morton and Baker. This changed the demeanor of Brewer's party significantly. If these reports were true, they may be walking into an ambush that could bring about significant loss of life and the fumbling of the highly sought fugitive. The number of men under Brewer's supervision that wanted to take matters into their own hands had just grown exponentially. But there was one particular member of Brewer's posse that further complicated matters. William McCloskey had presented himself to the group as someone who was sympathetic to their cause. He had been employed by Tunstall on a temporary basis and had what could be described as friendly relations with the bulk of Brewer's men. The caveat was that McCloskey had been a member of the posse that had come to attach the cattle to the Sween debt, the day Tunstall was slain, although McCloskey was not in the small contingent of men with Morton and Baker who carried out the execution. This fact brought him much distrust from the other men. Rumors amongst them began to spread that he was a spy, and may be attempting to divulge their plans to Dolan and his men. The whispers grew louder amongst the men of their suspicions for McCloskey, and the concern for the danger they faced from Dolan's ambush grew into extreme and palpable anxiety that had quickly overtaken the camp. Brewer gave Morton the opportunity to write a letter to a relative in Virginia that night. The letter would foreshadow the shocking turn of events that was soon to unfold. Within the long letter, Morton began an explanation of the job he had been sent on, attaching property in the service of a debt, as well as his version of events, that Tunstall had fired upon him and his men first, that the fire had been returned, and thus Tunstall had been killed. He recounts his arrest, being fired upon by 100 rounds as the Brewer posse gave chase, and his concern that they may be intending to kill him. He wrote, "I have heard that we are not to be taken alive to that place. I am not at all afraid of their killing me. But if they should do so, I wish that the matter should be investigated, and the parties dealt with according to the law. If you do not hear from me in 4 days after receipt of this, I would like you to make inquiries about the affair." The following morning, just after 10 o'clock, the Brewer party headed out from the Chisholm Ranch. They traveled ahead roughly 10 miles on the road to Lincoln. Then, unexpectedly, they changed course and headed north. They had rerouted using a seldom-traveled path to Lincoln that swung out almost to the foot of the Capitan Mountains, before turning back towards Lincoln. Should Dolan have stationed a contingent of men upon the primary road into Lincoln, this alternate route had surely circumvented his plans. It also served to lengthen their journey, and it would provide the cover of nightfall for their arrival in Lincoln. As they pressed on through the mountainous region, the party had drifted into further splits from one another in their travel. While they trekked their way through the Blackwater Canyon, Brewer, from his position near the rear of the convoy, heard a series of gunshots echoing through the gorge from just up ahead. An unsettling series of possibilities flashed through his mind on what he thought could be the cause, and while his thoughts feared the worst, he spurred his horse hard and sprinted forward to the front of the line. His fears were realized when he came upon the fresh corpses of Morton, Baker, and McCloskey. Morton's body had been peppered with 9 bullets, all delivered into his back. The account Brewer was given by his men was that Morton had been riding in front with McCloskey, grabbed his pistol, and shot him with it. Morton and Baker then raced forth to escape, and were cut down in the process. This story was as unbelievable as the account given by Morton in regards to the cold-blooded execution of John Tunstall, if not more so. Dolan's faction would spread reports of the event in a different way. McCloskey had declared himself to be the neutral party, and that he would protect the prisoners until they could be turned over in Lincoln, and that after doing so he had been shot, and the other men executed, while on their knees, begging for their lives. The truth about the events that occurred just a few hundred yards ahead of Brewer that late winter day in Blackwater Canyon are still unclear. But what is undeniable is that what occurred served to greatly increase hostilities, and soon also the body count in the ongoing blood feud that has come to be known as the Lincoln County War. But the tales of ruthlessness and retribution that hold the truth and consequences of the New Mexican mountains are, for tonight, other stories, for other times. Thank you for joining us on this episode of History at the OK Corral. Be sure to click the like button, share this episode with a friend, and become a subscriber. Also, if you'd like to support our work and gain early access to episodes, as well as ad-free viewing, You can become a member of this channel by clicking on the blue join button below. Thank you again for watching, and we'll see you next time on History at the OK Corral, home of history's greatest shootouts and showdowns.